middle of the jet lag. Still, I hope that I can somehow chair this session. And this time in panel number 4, final panel of this day features such issues as coordination, public engagement, and institutional memory. As for coordination, we learned that coordination in post-conflict situations seeks to reduce overlap, improve efficiency, and enhance effectiveness of interventions and actors. And in particular, coordination is very useful and instrumental in prioritizing, sequencing, and planning. For example, through donor conferences. And also coordination in implementation is very useful and should be well planned. And regarding the public engagement, we found that the most successful and sustainable programs engaged local communities and the public every step of the way. Namely, conducting a conflict analysis, developing programs, developing projects, including development of the project's environmental impact assessment. And also that public engagement should be designed into the implementation of the project as well as post-project evaluation. And as for the institutional memory, the evaluation policy of the USAID says every step of USAID's programming model, from design to implementation to evaluation, will be undertaken from the perspective not only of achieving development objectives, but of contributing to the broader goal of learning from experience. I quite agree to this sentence. And I believe that 3 key opportunities do exist in terms of the enhancing or developing institutional memory. One is serving as or developing the mechanism for public clearinghouses to collect and exchange of a broad array of information on development initiatives. And also, information sharing mechanisms should be made use of, such as web portals and wiki pages. And also, information sharing can extend beyond those experts and agencies working in international development to include technical experts in domestic line agencies, as illustrated the need of doing this by presentation by a few authors. Well, without further delay, I ask 3 speakers to make presentations one after another. Well, Jennifer, you have the floor.
So I'm Jennifer Wallace from the University of Maryland, and I should begin as well by acknowledging my co-author, Ken Konka from American University, who I'm sure will add new insights and anything I leave off during the Q&A session. So the chapter written by my co-author and I examines a multi-part USAID initiative on forest conflict that took place from 2002 to 2006. The initiative consists of 3 distinct phases, so this slide gives a snapshot of the timeline of the initiative within AID. The action plan was completed at the direction of then Administrator Andrew Natsios in order to find out more about the scope of the problem of conflict timber, which was getting a lot of media attention in 2001, largely because of the NGO Global Witness's efforts to raise awareness at the time about conflict timber in Liberia, which we heard about earlier with Lisa and Sandy's presentation. So this effort led to 2 follow-on projects, first to learn more about the scope of the problem in both Asia and Africa, and then a focus project in Asia to develop more specific programming recommendations and to generate further awareness of the problem among an expanding set of actors that were identified as relevant to integrating natural resources management and peacebuilding objectives. So in this presentation, I would like to discuss how USAID defined and framed the problem of forest conflict and the implications for how the conceptual framework shaped the strategies to address the conflicts in Asia. Additionally, and fitting within the theme of this 4th panel, I'm going to speak briefly about how the set of actors targeted by the initiative expanded over the life cycle of the project. So this map provides a snapshot of where forest-based armed conflicts have been most intense, which were Cambodia, Myanmar, and the Philippines during the 1990s, and later Nepal and India. Also Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and East Timor have more recently had high levels of conflict. So it's useful to focus on this region in particular because it presents a highly diverse set of forest-related conflicts. A lot of attention had been paid to forest-related conflict in Africa due to the problem of illegal extraction and the financing of conflict, such as, again, in the case of Liberia. But in Asia, the problem of forest conflict is similarly extensive, especially due to the higher percentage of the population that live as forest dwellers and the proximity to China as a main importer of timber. So the types of forest conflict that we see in Asia are different than those in Africa. The consulting firm ARD was the key implementing partner for USAID in both phases of the project, and they defined the problem of conflict timber by breaking it into these 2 typologies. So type 1 forest conflict are forest conflicts defined as conflict financed or sustained through the harvest and sale of timber. And type 2 forest conflicts were conflict emerging as a result of competition over timber or other forest resources. So even though a sharp distinction was drawn between timber logging that financed arms sales and these more generic endemic sorts of conflicts that came from the competing use of forests by different stakeholder groups, both forms of conflict can involve high levels of violence and were identified by USAID as central to the conflict management challenge. So this table lists the countries in Asia for which profiles were assembled during the project and how they were characterized as far as these 2, the type 1 and type 2 kinds of forest conflict. So the Asia profiles revealed widespread type 2 conflict as well as type 1 linkages in half of the countries profiled. And while I didn't show the Africa cases here, all but one of the Africa cases yielded evidence of the type 1 forest conflict, the financing, but little in the way of the endemic or multiple use type 2 conflict. And we found that these very different regional patterns led to different patterns of interest and uptake between the 2 regions at the USAID programmatic level. Through our interviews that we did with staff, implementing partners, and other experts on forest conflict, there was some evidence that type 2 conflicts, although they could also be violent and lead to grievances against the state, were viewed at the USAID mission level as being outside the scope of the conflict mitigation operations, or they were intractable, or both. So one of the goals of the project came to be making the relevance of type 2 conflicts clear to those tasked with addressing conflict management. We also found that the clear classification of type 1 and type 2 conflicts in USAID's initial report may undermine the perceived salience of type 2 conflict. However, the conflict timber aspect of the problem is what actually originally drew the attention of the USAID administrator to the issue of forest conflict at a time when conflict resources were receiving considerable media attention. So this split classification was something of a double-edged sword as far as drawing attention to the issue. The project also provided an analytical framework for understanding forest conflict, which emphasized the key properties of the commercial chain of timber production, or a supply chain or industry structure approach, or other ways of labeling it. So within this conceptual framework, there were three key aspects of the industrial structure of the timber sector that were identified as critical variables in forest conflict and its management. So these were referred to as commodity characteristics, market characteristics, and governance characteristics. The key elements of these characteristics are shown here on the slide. Framing the problem in this way comes with several advantages and disadvantages, however. One advantage is that this connects localized activities around forests to the larger economic forces that are driving at least some of the extractive activity at the site of the conflict. It also sheds light on the power relations up and down the supply chain and highlights potential points of regulatory intervention in terms of those power relations. Some disadvantages are that the focus on the market aspects don't necessarily focus the USAID initiative on the nodes where the violence really takes place. So it's unclear looking at this framework what the primary actors and reasons are for the conflicts over the forests. Also, by taking a sectoral view that stresses market relations among profit-driven actors, it could underemphasize the importance of political, social, or cultural aspects, as well as certain types of actors and relationships. It emphasizes exclusively the material dimensions of the actors' interests as opposed to any symbolic or normative significance of the forests. So of the three sets of characteristics used to assess the propensity for forest conflict, two of them, the market characteristics and the governance characteristics, or the commodity characteristics, can't really be changed by USAID activities over the short timeline, at least, of the project. So as a result, the third set of governance characteristics moves to center stage as far as the terms of policies and programs. So the effect of framing forest conflicts in terms of commodity, market, and governance characteristics is that much of the emphasis on post-conflict natural resources management is constructed as a problem of regulation, which then leads to a focus on the legality of the extractive activities and the legal framework governing property rights and forest access. Yet it's very important to point out here that the problem is much more complex than defining what is legal from what is illegal. In many instances, local communities with longstanding ties to forest-based livelihoods may question the legitimacy of the state's forestry laws. The USAID project reports note that governments are almost always complicit in forest conflicts, and so projects that focus on very narrow conceptions of legality may be ineffective. Additionally, what's legal may not necessarily be sustainable and could contribute to or exacerbate multiple use conflicts if they're not properly managed. Additionally, and in fitting with this panel's theme on coordination and engagement, although the initial objective of the Forest Conflict Initiative was to raise awareness among the individual USAID missions of the importance of integrating natural resources management into their programming objectives, the first phase of the project made it clear that the issue was on a far greater scale than any one mission could address in its activities. So given the complex ways that forest conflict was embedded in timber markets, national development plans, as well as conservation initiatives, and the many levels on which rulemaking and institution building occurred, it was imperative for the project to raise awareness among a larger and heterogeneous audience, including government actors in Asia, NGOs that served as implementing partners for USAID programs, the international donor community, and private sector actors who occupied positions of power in international commodity chains for forest products. So perhaps the key takeaway point is that effective solutions as far as integrating natural resources management and peace building in these cases must take into account the various stakeholders involved throughout the life cycle of the forest and forest products, and as well raise awareness and be sensitive to the multiple levels of government involved in the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone. My name is Alex Fisher. I'm a program manager and research associate at Columbia University's Center for International Earth Science and Information Network, called CEASN, as well as working with the Earth Institute at Columbia University. So I'm here today to present our case study that we've been working on for the last couple of years, which is specifically a focus on Haiti. And so I'd like to acknowledge that this has been done in parallel with actual work that we're doing in Haiti on designing a series of long-term interventions that are were originally focused on environmental restoration, and now are looking at broader development issues. And we're doing this in very close partnership and tight coordination with the United Nations Environment Programs, Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch, as well as several local Haitian technical institutes, NGOs, and several large international non-governmental organizations. So inherently within this presentation, there's reflections on not just the overall state and what the development field in Haiti has been doing for the past 20 or 30 years, but also on what process we've been through in the past 3 years trying to launch this program and how to build from the lessons learned. So first, I just wanted to contextualize what really started this project and started the kind of analysis here with this project. We have been thinking about, how do you design long-term restoration in politically unstable conditions? And so this chart here looks at both specifically the economic, the fluctuations in the per capita income, the rate at which the number of disasters per year, and then at the bottom looking at the changes in the political regimes. So these three macro scale indicators show significant variation in income generation with a steep decline since the 1980s towards the end or the fall of the Duvalier regime, paired with an increase in number of natural disasters, and on a political side looking at extreme variation and fluctuation between different both elected officials, military coups, and increasing levels of instability caused both by changes in regimes as well as different levels of riots and internal pressures. So within this, you can see there's a wide range of risks and vulnerability and variabilities that impact national scale planning. So with the changes of regimes, you see different policymakers coming in and out, different priorities within the aid agenda, both from an international level and from a national planning level, as well as levels of violence and insecurity that are influencing both the ability to execute aid projects as well as part of the planning in terms of how do you stabilize the political scene in order to execute larger development. So within this, we started our analysis thinking about how do you really address the underlying kind of vicious downward spiral of environmental degradation that's occurring across the landscape. So in the center, you see a chart that shows forest cover in years. It's not derived from exact data, but taking points from land cover maps from the 1960s to as recently as a few years ago, you see a steady or a pretty sharp decline in forest cover across the country. At the same time, you see this cycle, and the main questions that we were asking is how do you address and reverse the cycle of environmental degradation towards a positive or a recovery framework. And so you see these intertwining of issues from the demands from energy, from charcoal consumption within the urban areas, which are putting pressures on the rural areas for deforestation, and agriculture, the need, which is the primary source of income across the country, is increasing. So you're seeing increases in land clearing and intensive agriculture. So this is a cycle in which you're seeing erosion, loss of soil fertility, loss of forest cover, which is linked to the increased flooding. So you see a downward cycle across both environmental and ecosystem characteristics as well as livelihoods. And so the questions that we were posing at the beginning is, how do you design aid in an effective way that can catalyze change at a large enough scale to impact overall ecosystem health and reverse these trends? And so this is another example of an excellent report that was done by USAID in 2008, which at a national scale helped create the planning framework by doing a variety of different analyses on different types of vulnerability. So you see in the upper right a map, although the level of specificity is challenging for local scale planning. At a national scale, you can see soil risk, the risk of soil erosion at a national scale, population density, which is another vulnerability factor and risk factor that we were looking at, clustered in the center part of the country, which is where Port-au-Prince is. The flood maps also show flooding risk is highest in the urban areas, and infrastructure, the clustering of infrastructure, corresponds with population, which then corresponds with flooding. So you see risk to the urban areas and where the population is highest, has the highest density. So the question of the chapter began with, is this an exception or warning? How do you design coherent strategies in the context of instability and variability? And how do you affect change at an ecosystem level? How do you catalyze environmental restoration at a geographic scale that's going to create change across the country? So I cherry-picked a few of the specific recommendations for this panel. What I wanted to start with was, and one that was mentioned in the panel earlier, but will lead into further ones, is the timescale of the projects. Most of the projects, an analysis that we did with UNEP in 2009, you can see from this chart that most of the these are projects that have an environmental focus. Most of these projects are between 2 and 5 years. Less than 20% of them are funded over 5 years, and about 25% or 23% are less than 2 years. So you see a range of the time commitments that funders are putting into the projects. But yet, when you talk about ecosystem restoration or recovery in a complex and post-conflict setting, it's difficult to talk about that restoration happening in this short of a time period. So we see risks in terms of the commitment to aid at a scale long enough to affect change. But more than that, and something that I think we've really noticed in the analysis of multiple aid projects, is that the investment in staff and the investment in the organizations that implement these, when you're having a short time frame, and especially for local NGOs that don't have the financial capacity to absorb decreases in funding, a lot of projects were started and got off the ground in 2 to 3 years, and we're just at the point of starting to see tangible results when the aid funding stopped. And for local groups, that means the project stops. And a lot of the funding for international programs were often with staff from firms that would then leave the country. So you saw vulnerability there. This leads into the second point, is how do you design and structure the programs? This is very much focused at a local level, but thinking about when you're doing aid funding, how do you pair that with both the government, local, regional, national, the community, and other NGOs? So this is there's a case from a program that FAO and the IDB did in Marmalade, which is a town in the north, which put in place a community management organization with outreach agents and technical support from the national government, as well as funding from FAO and IDB. This chart here is an example from the Millennium Village projects, which is something that we're trying to launch in the south of Haiti, which looks at shared funding across partners. So inherently from the beginning of the project, you diversify your risk by spreading it across multiple partners. And you also build a coherency of the partnership because you have multiple stakeholders investing. So then on the issue of coordination, this is a study that we also did in the area that we're working in the Southwest. This is a map that shows the number of, I have to go very quickly, the number of projects per commune. It shows that it's not spread out across. There's a clustering in specific communes. And I could, if I had more time, I could go into the reason for that. But so thinking about how do you motivate coordination, this is a matrices that we put together looking at on the vertical is the different sectors, on the horizontal are the communes, and trying to look at where is investment occurring by sector and by commune. And then thinking about how do you spread that out and how do you coordinate the different donors across those sectors. So how do you prioritize, identify the priorities for those sectors, and then make sure that investment is consistent for integrated development across these different areas. And finally, we've thought about, when you're talking about environmental restoration in Haiti, most projects are defined around administrative boundaries rather than ecological boundaries. And so we've seen challenges in terms of implementing coherent agriculture, forestry, restoration programs when you're only targeting a small part. So this is a model, a topographical model of the watershed in which we're working. There's 3 communes that are part of this, 2 of which are partly outside of the watershed. So inherently from the design perspective, you're faced with challenges in terms of how do you reach at a coherent ecological scale the entire watershed, but yet still plan around the administrative boundaries, which are the primary engines for all the distribution of funds and planning. And so what we've been trying to do is work with communities to think about interventions that target both the upper watershed, the lower watershed, and ridge to reef approaches, but can kind of overcome some of these administrative boundaries. And so this is just to summarize, but I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
My name is Naoshi Moyachi, and I'm a research fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And I look into the case of Cambodia's land mine problem with a focus on mine clearance and land management. And I also examined how international society assisted Cambodian efforts in this field, and our focus is placed on Japan, one of the largest donors. So first of all, I would like to remind you that landmines are a significant obstacle to peace building, not just in Cambodia, but also in many post-conflict countries. And first, they continue to kill and maim people, civilians, even after the end of hostilities. And second, landmines delay the resettlement and the returns of refugees and internally displaced peoples. And thirdly, they block access to vital resources and social services, including lands and natural resources such as waters and farmland. And finally, the cost of mine removal and victim assistance weigh heavily on countries struggling to recover from conflict. So Cambodia is, as you may already know, Cambodia is one of the most heavily mine-affected countries in the world, but also at the same time, it is one of the few countries that are linking demining to the larger peace building and development plans. So in doing so, the country has been developing decentralized mechanisms that engage local populations and communities. So mine clearance is not just costly, but it progresses very slowly. This is because recently more efficient demining techniques such as mine detection dogs and machines are being used widely, but manual metal detectors remain the primary techniques in order to make sure that not a single mine is left unremoved. So the fact point to the needs of setting priorities among minefields to clears, taking into account the needs to protect civilians and to put mine clearance to put mine-affected countries on the path to recovery. So what I try to argue with this case study is that international and national policies should be designed to link mine removals to larger national development and peace building plans. And more specifically, we need to set priorities among minefields to clears and improve land management and legislation. I'd also find that decentralized approach may be effective for priority setting and rural development. So I'd like to look at Cambodia's demining strategies in more detail with a focus on local engagement and coordination, which is the focus of this panel as well. And first of all, I'd like to look at the key actors of Cambodia's mine actions. The first to be mentioned is the CMAC, which is placed at the center of these figures, Cambodian Mine Action Centers. It is a national demining operator established in 1992, just after the signing of the Paris Peace Accord in Cambodia. And in the year 2000, another body called CMAA, which is the Cambodian Mine Action and Victim Assistance Authorities, was established to be in charge of regulation and coordinations. The idea was to separate executive body from oversight body. The other demining agencies include international NGOs, and also Cambodian army is also involved as well. So now I'd like to look at Cambodia's demining planning process. And it is a bottom-up process starting at the village level. It also ensures coordination with land authorities in order to make sure that land removal of mines is distributed fairly. The actual planning lands on an annual cycle. It begins in January or February with a commune meeting where village chiefs and commune council members discuss and propose priority areas for demining. The proposal must be backed up by good reasons such as frequencies of mine accidents, a lack of schools, roads and health centers, and other infrastructures, or a lack of access to resources such as agricultural land and water. The commune plan is then sent to the district levels. The district is one level up from the village level, where the district working group, DWG, comprising representatives of the district, NGOs, CMAC, select minefields to clear in light of the needs of the villagers, and also donors' plans are considered as well. The DWG meeting is usually held by August, and in September or October, MAPU is a mine action planning unit, and this is provincial level special committees involving deminers and also donors and the local community representatives. This is a special committees designed to coordinate demining needs. And then this MAPU and CMAC conduct field investigation in September or October to check if selected areas for demining comply with criteria in terms of intended land use and beneficiary selection, land ownership, and so on. And then by the end of November, another key provincial committee, PMAC, this is a technical committee chaired by the vice governor, provincial governors, and the PMAC determines priority minefields in line with the National Mine Action Plan, and which reflect the needs of national and local development and poverty reduction programs. And the final plan is then submitted to the CMAA, the national regulatory body. And also, I'd like to look at briefly the assistance of Japan, the largest donor to mine action in Cambodia until the year 2007. Actually, in 2008, Japan was overtaken by Australia. So, the characteristic of Japanese ODA is its focus on the research and development of demining machines. Of the total assistance provided in 2007, about 69% went for this purpose. So as this figure shows, put into operation in 2005, the machines are credited with having almost double the productivities of mine clearance. The total land area cleared in 2005 was more than twice in 2004. But the problem is demining machines cannot be used in the areas where anti-tank mines are suspected to have been laid, since many of Cambodia's minefields are a mixture of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, reflecting the intensity of internal conflict. Most mine clearance is still being conducted manually using metal detectors. So to complement this ODA assistance, several NGOs are also involved in Cambodia demining efforts. One interesting case in this regard is a project called community-based demining. It is designed to train local peoples to demine their community without waiting for professional demining operators, along with community development plans. So in rural mine-affected communities, villagers are often no other means of livelihood but to cultivate land, even if they know that mines are laid there, which results in unfortunate accident. So the project was born out of an effort to prevent such accidents. The recruited villagers are sent to the training centers run by national operator CIMAC, and for 6 weeks technical training programs. And the monthly salary is $105 US. This is quite a sum when we consider the average annual household incomes in the commune is somewhere around $700 US. So the project is much smaller in scale than the Japanese ODA in terms of the budget and areas covers, but it introduced in the most mine-affected poor communities. It serves not only the purpose of mine clearance, but also contributes to generating incomes and also enhancing the sense of local ownership in the rehabilitation and development of the community. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the keys to Cambodia's community-based bottom-up mechanism was to involve all concerned parties at all levels, including the commune councils, the provincial rural development department, land authorities, and others relevant ministry, demining agencies, and international donors. In tackling landmine problem, it is important to make continued efforts to seek efficiencies, but at the same time, qualitative aspect of demining is equally important. Cambodia's case suggests the importance of local engagement and coordination among relevant actors in order to ensure effective use of mine-cleared land. Thank you.
Well, we still have one more presentation by yours truly. This case dealt with one river basin organization called Mekong Committee. And the Mekong Committee was established more than half a century ago with membership of the 4 countries in the lower Mekong River Basin, namely Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. And in 1975, you may recall what happened to these Indochina countries. And communist governments were established in 3 of these countries, namely Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, triggered by the end of Vietnamese War back in April 1975. And ironically, the major political aim of the Mekong Committee was to prevent Indochina countries from communization by economic development of these regions, but it resulted in failure by communism domino experienced in this region. So the committee was to protect these countries from communism, but these countries were communized except Thailand. So the committee was on the verge of disappearance. It was in fact defunct for 2 years thereafter. Yeah, this slide shows communism domino in the lower part of the Mekong River Basin in 3 countries. So what happened thereafter? Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam in 1977, after 2 years of the Mekong Committee being defunct, these countries decided to reactivate the collaborative scheme by establishing interim Mekong Committee in Cambodia's absence. Cambodia was in chaos then. And European countries, Australia and Japan supported the committee, interim committee, in place of USA. In that, United States used to be the largest donor before communism domino, and it stopped supporting to the Mekong Committee thereafter. The committee was thus not supposed to pursue large-scale basin-wide development scheme. The interim Mekong Committee firstly concentrated on projects at national level. What kind of accomplishments were made by this interim body? 1, as I mentioned, development and implementation of national projects. 2, carrying out research and planning of basin-wide development scheme when the political atmosphere would allow to implement such a project. And for this sake, back in 1980, the Interim Mekong Committee published revised indicative basin plan, which is a blueprint or a master plan for the basin-wide development of the water resources. And also, Interim Mekong Committee integrated some new trends into planning and implementation of the project, such as environmental considerations and public participation. And also, Interim Mekong Committee carried out outreaching activities, including provision of hydrological data and information for anybody interested. And gradually, that Interim Mekong Committee started dealing with some basin-wide projects. Back in 1987, the majority of the projects were national projects. But in 1991, half of the projects were national, the other half for basin-wide projects. What kind of lessons we can learn from this case? When a conflict is over and preserving an institutional framework proves politically difficult, as was the case exactly with Mekong Committee, a safety net should be sought and mobilized. And in this case, the umbrella of the United Nations was instrumental because United Nations support countries regardless of the political regime. And also, changes of political regimes in countries does not mean the end of collaborative minds of these countries. The Mekong spirit, the collaboration and coordination among riparian states of the Mekong River Basin was highly applauded. And this Mekong spirit was in the mind of new communism government of Laos and Vietnam, despite of the original aim of Mekong Committee. And also, efforts should be made by post-conflict region not to be forgotten by international society. And the presence of Interim Mekong Committee, in particular its outreaching service, was instrumental so that other countries still remember or still listen to activities of this committee and these countries. And the transparency information of the basin was also very effective to keep attention of practitioners and researchers to the Mekong River Basin during that difficult time. And also putting emphasis on economic interest, not political interests, may be a viable option for survival of an institutional framework after conflict. Then, Japanese experts were attached to the committee. And these Japanese, the committee, these experts were not connected with particular projects. And these experts functioned as very cost-effective information channel with Laos and Vietnam for a decade after the conflict, when Japan suspended ODA to these countries. And information transparency pays. It inspired many research activities as well as project ideas by third parties at no cost to the committee. And also, mass media kept promoting interests of Japanese society in the Mekong River and its basin countries. Thank you very much. So we still have quite a bit of time for comments and question and answer. Please, for those who have questions or comments, please raise your hand and talk to the microphone, identify yourself, and tell to whom your question or comment should be addressed. Well, the floor is open. Any question or comment? Carl?
Carl Brook, Environmental Law Institute. I had kind of related questions on coordination, particularly for Alex and for now, but I'm also curious if this came up in the context of the two AID projects or initiatives that were described in Jenny and Ken's case study. For now, I was curious, going back to the issue that John raised this morning, where you had road building separated from the laws and institutions governing land. Was there any thought of connecting the demining of land to the land reform processes, to the building of institutions to govern land? So, or do you just make land available and then there's a governance vacuum to protect the prior owners of the land? So at the programming level, do you know if there was any connection? And Alex, you had talked at lunch. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts about how do you coordinate so many agencies working in Haiti? And are there any sectoral coordination efforts on a weekly or monthly basis around water or land or forestry, anything in the environmental arena and coordination? Thank you.
Sure. So, managing multiple agencies. I think in that one map that I showed, you can see that there's even within a geographic range, there's a huge variation in the number of actors. That was a map of projects. We have a similar one of the number of NGOs operating in those areas. And so there's a couple levels. I think one, at a national scale, there's efforts to map large NGOs and government and bilateral donors and international organizations, map box, or so there's a program online that does that. So there's an effort at a national scale, but that often misses the fine details that is where the actual work is happening. In terms of kind of coordination mechanisms, there's at a national scale, and particularly post-earthquake, were cluster meetings that the UN hosted, which were not based around the themes that you mentioned, but were based around shelter, communication, housing. There were a bunch of them. So those were basically information sharing platforms. They never reached what I would claim or would argue would be a coordination mechanism. The government of Haiti has sectoral tables. So they have a health sector table and agriculture sector table. And that, again, brings together the ministries, and then there's attendance from some of the large NGOs and large kind of project-based teams. But again, I don't think that necessarily reaches what we would be defining as effective coordination. And it doesn't necessarily pull together different organizations under a planning framework or under a type of context that would allow for strategic decisions and interrelated decisions. So one organization saying, I'll target the protection of water sources, and one organization saying, I'll build the pipes to get the water down. I don't think that level of coordination really exists, and it's something that in terms of reviewing USAID projects that have a very specific focus on watershed management, there was not extensive evidence that was happening, where these bodies, these large-scale, well-funded projects were acting as that type of management body within a watershed. And so the question is, how do you effectively implement that?
No.
Just as Professor John Woods mentioned in the morning session, in the case of Afghanistan, the land is a very sensitive issue in Cambodia as well, because land grabbing by people with power and authority is very rampant. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that Cambodia's land tenures remain unclear, largely because private ownership was totally abolished during the reigns of the Khmer Rouge eras. So today's once the Vietnam, which occupied Cambodia until 1989, when the Vietnamese withdrew, the private ownership of land was reintroduced, but still the vast tax remains classified as state land, and most landowners do not hold land titles. So in fact, the bottom-up community-based process of how to prioritize the lands to clear landmines was in fact an effort to ensure that the land clear of mines is returned to local peoples, because it gives local peoples the rights and the decision-making authorities to plans the land use after mine removal as well. So still there are many conflicts between the state and the local communities, but at least in the 8 provinces where the bottom-up process is now introduced, the efforts to prevent the land grabbing by the state is somehow improving, I guess. Thank you.
Jennifer and or Ken?
Sure. I guess to the extent that there are similar coordination issues that took place within the context of our project, maybe one example, at least as far as the management of institutions, would be that it just became clear over the lifespan of the project that raising awareness just within or at the mission level within USAID was going to be insufficient to really do anything significant on the ground. And so it became much more clear that other donor agencies, other implementing partners, the private sector needed to be brought on board as well. And so to that effect, there were meetings held in Washington and Brussels to bring together all of the relevant stakeholders, as also within the countries, the local stakeholders, to get everybody on the same page as far as understanding why natural resources management is important to peace building, and to make sure that people working in peace building and conservation we're not going to be working at cross purposes. There may be also some other analogous situations as far as the coordination or maybe competing land tenure issues between local communities and the national government. Maybe Ken wants to speak to that or something else.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it's quite clear that the questions of land tenure, access rights, use rights, rule of law systems that are incomplete or illegitimate or not inclusive or not sensitive to tradition, we're really at the heart of the much more common type 2 kinds of conflicts that are